The Polaris missile was a two-stage solid-fuel rocket nuclear-armed submarine-launched ballistic missile built during the Cold War by Lockheed Corporation of California for the United States Navy. It was designed to be used for second strike countervalue as part of the Navy's contribution to the United States arsenal of nuclear weapons, replacing the Regulus cruise missile. Known as a Fleet Ballistic Missile, the Polaris was first launched from the Cape Canaveral, Florida, missile test base on January 7, 1960. Following the Polaris sales agreement in 1963, Polaris missiles were also carried on British Royal Navy submarines between 1968 and the mid-1990s. Plans to equip the Italian Navy with the missile ended in the mid-60s, after several successful test launches carried out on board the Italian cruiser Giuseppe Garibaldi. Despite the successful launching tests, the U.S. never provided the missiles, due to political convenience. Instead, the Italian government set to develop an indigenous missile, called Alpha, with a successful program, officially halted by Italian nuclear non-proliferation treaty ratification and failure of the NATO multilateral force. The Polaris missile was gradually replaced on 31 of the 41 original SSBNs in the U.S. Navy by the MIRV-capable Poseidon missile beginning in 1972. During the 1980s, these missiles were replaced on 12 of these submarines by the Trident I missile. The 10 George Washington and Ethan Allen class SSBNs retained Polaris A3 until 1980 because their missile tubes were not large enough to accommodate Poseidon. With USS Ohio commencing sea trials in 1980, these submarines were disarmed and redesignated as attack submarines to avoid exceeding the SALT II Strategic Arms Treaty limits. Many new project management techniques were introduced during the development of the Polaris missile program, to deal with the inherent system complexity. This includes the use of the program evaluation and review technique. This technique replaced the simpler Gantt chart methodology which was largely employed prior to this program. History and development. The Polaris missile replaced an earlier plan to create a submarine-based missile force based on a derivative of the U.S. Army Jupiter Intermediate-Range Ballistic Missile. Rear Admiral W.F. Red Reborn headed a special project office to develop Jupiter for the Navy, beginning in late 1955. The Jupiter missile's large diameter was a product of the need to keep the length short enough to fit in a reasonably sized submarine. In December 1956 the Navy withdrew from Jupiter to develop Polaris, which was designed by Rear Admiral Roderick Osgood Middleton, and is still under Admiral Reborn's Special Project Office. There is a contention that the Navy's Jupiter missile program was unrelated to the Army program. A huge surface submarine would carry 4 Jupiter missiles, which would be carried and launched horizontally. This was probably the never-built SSMN-2 Triton program. However, a history of the Army's Jupiter program states that the Navy was involved in the Army program, but withdrew at an early stage. At Project Nebska in 1956, Edward Teller stated that a physically small 1 megaton warhead could be produced for Polaris, and this prompted the Navy to leave the Jupiter program in December of that year. Originally, the Navy favored cruise missile systems in a strategic role, such as the Regulus missile deployed on the earlier USS Greyback and a few other submarines, but a major drawback of these early cruise missile launch systems was the need to surface, and remain surfaced for some time, to launch. Submarines were very vulnerable to attack during launch, and a fully or partially fueled missile on deck was a serious hazard. Rough weather was another major drawback for these designs, but rough sea conditions did not unduly affect Polaris submerged launches. It quickly became apparent solid-fueled ballistic missiles had advantages over cruise missiles in range and accuracy, and unlike both Jupiter and Cruise, were able to be launched from a submerged submarine, improving submarine survivability. The prime contractor for all 3 versions of Polaris was Lockheed Missiles and Space Company, now Lockheed Martin. The Polaris program started development in 1956. USS George Washington, the first U.S. missile submarine, successfully launched the first Polaris missile from a submerged submarine on July 20, 1960. The A2 version of the Polaris missile was essentially an upgraded A1, and it entered service in late 1961. It was fitted on a total of 13 submarines and served until June 1974. 1. Ongoing problems with the W-47 warhead, especially with its mechanical arming and safing equipment, led to large numbers of the missiles being recalled for modifications, and the U.S. Navy sought a replacement with either a larger yield or equivalent destructive power. The result was the W-58 warhead used in a cluster of 3 warheads for the Polaris A3, the final model of the Polaris Missile. Guidance A predecessor to the GPS satellite navigation system, the transit system, was developed because the submarines needed to know their position at launch in order for the missiles to hit their targets. 2 American physicists, William Guire and George Y. Fenbach, at Johns Hopkins's Applied Physics Laboratory, began this work in 1958. A computer small enough to fit through a submarine hatch was developed in 1958, the ANUYK-1. It was used to interpret the transit satellite data and send guidance information to the Polaris, which had its own guidance computer made with ultra-miniaturized electronics, very advanced for its time, because there wasn't much room in a Polaris there were 16 on each submarine. Even the existence of these computers is still classified, so we don't know for sure, for example, whether the Polaris A1 had an onboard computer, but the A3 must have. The ship's inertial navigation system was developed earlier to provide a continuous dead reckoning update of the submarine's position between position fixes via other methods, such as LORAN. This was especially important in the first few years of Polaris, because transit was not operational until 1964. By 1965, microchips similar to the Texas Instruments units made for the Minuteman II were being purchased by the Navy for the Polaris. The Minuteman guidance systems each required 2,000 of these, so the Polaris guidance system may have used a similar number. To keep the price under control, the design was standardized and shared with Westinghouse Electric Company and RCA. The price came down dramatically, from $1,000 to $20 to $2, and they came to be used in commercial products. Polaris A3 This missile replaced the earlier A1 and A2 models in the U.S. Navy, and also equipped the British Polaris Force. The A3 had a range extended to 2,500 nautical miles and a new weapon bay housing 3 Mk2 re-entry vehicles. And the new W-58 warhead of 200 carats yield. This arrangement was originally described as a cluster warhead, but was replaced with the term multiple re-entry vehicle. The 3 warheads were spread about a common target and were not independently targeted. The 3 warheads were stated to be equivalent in destructive power to a single 1 megaton warhead. Later the Polaris A3 missiles were also given limited hardening to protect the missile electronics against electromagnetic pulse effects while in the boost phase. This was known as the A3T and was the final production model. Polaris A1. The initial test model of the Polaris was referred to as the AX series and made its maiden flight from Cape Canaveral on September 24, 1958. The missile failed to perform its pitch and roll maneuver and instead just flew straight up, however the flight was considered a partial success. The next flight on October 15 failed spectacularly when the second stage ignited on the pad and took off by itself. Range safety blew up the errant rocket while the first stage sat on the pad and burned. The third and fourth tests had problems due to overheating in the boat tail section. This necessitated adding extra shielding and insulation to wiring and other components. When the final AX flight was conducted a year after the program began, 17 Polaris missiles had been flown, of which 5 met all of their test objectives. The first operational version, the Polaris A1, had a range of 1,000 nautical miles and a single Mk1 re-entry vehicle, carrying a single W-47Y1 600 carats nuclear warhead, with an inertial guidance system which provided a circular area probable of 1,800 meters. The 2-stage solid propellant missile had a length of 28.5 feet, a body diameter of 54 inches, and a launch weight of 28,800 pounds. USS George Washington was the first Fleet Ballistic Missile submarine, and she and all of the other Polaris submarines carried 16 missiles. 40 more SSBNs were launched in 1960 to 1966. Work on its W-47 nuclear warhead began in 1957 at the facility that is now called the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory by a team headed by John Foster and Harold Brown. The Navy accepted delivery of the first 16 warheads in July 1960. On May 6, 1962, a Polaris A2 missile with a live W-47 warhead was tested in the frigate bird test of Operation Dominic by USS Ethan Allen in the Central Pacific Ocean, the only American test of a live strategic nuclear missile. The two stages were both steered by thrust vectoring. Inertial navigation guided the missile to about a 900 mCEP, insufficient for use against hardened targets. They were mostly useful for attacking dispersed military surface targets, clearing a pathway for heavy bombers, although in the general public perception Polaris was a strategic second-strike retaliatory weapon. Strategic role. The Polaris A1 missile was developed to complement the limited number of medium-range systems deployed throughout Europe. As those systems lacked the range to attack major Soviet targets, Polaris was developed to increase the level of nuclear deterrence. At this time there was little threat of counterforce strikes, as few systems had the accuracy to destroy missile systems. The primary advantages of ballistic missile submarines was their ability to launch submerged, which offered improved survivability for the submarine while also keeping shorter-ranged systems within range. The USN had forward basing arrangements for its Atlantic-based Polaris fleet with both the United Kingdom and Spain, permitting the use of bases at the Holy Loch in Scotland and at Naval Station Rota in the Bay of Cadiz. The forward deployment bases were much closer to patrol areas than U.S. East Coast bases, avoiding the necessity for lengthy transit times. In the Pacific, a Polaris base was also established at Guam in 1964. The Regulus missile program was deactivated with the advent of Polaris in the Pacific. The forward basing arrangement was continued when Poseidon replaced Polaris, starting in 1972, in what by then were the 31 Atlantic Fleet SSBNs. The 10 older SSBNs that could not use Poseidon were assigned to the Pacific Fleet in the 1970s. Polaris was not accurate enough to destroy hardened targets, but would have been effective against dispersed surface targets, such as airfields, radar and SAM sites, as well as military and industrial centers of strategic importance. The military authorities, however, regarded Polaris as but one part of a nuclear triad including ICBMs and bombers, each with its own function. The task allotted to Polaris of taking out peripheral defenses was well suited to its characteristics and limitations. The forward deployment strategy required some infrastructure. To allow quick establishment of bases and to minimize the impact on the host country, each base was centered around a submarine tender and a floating dry dock, with minimal facilities on shore, mostly family support for the tender's crew. The first Polaris submarine tender was USS Proteus, a World War II tender that was refitted in 1959 a Euro 60 with the insertion of a midships missile storage compartment and handling crane. Proteus established each of the 3 forward deployment bases. 4 additional Polaris tenders were commissioned 1962 a Euro 65. A 2-crew concept was established for SSBNs, combined with forward deployment to maximize the time each submarine would spend on patrol. The crews were named Blue and Gold after the U.S. Naval Academy colors. The crews were deployed for 105 days and at their home bases for 95 days, with a 3-day turnover period on each end of the deployed period. Crews were flown from their home bases to and from the forward deployment bases. After taking over the boat, the crew would perform a 30-day refit assisted by the tender, followed by a 70-day deterrent patrol. Sometimes a port visit would be arranged in the middle of the patrol. The home bases for Atlantic Fleet crews were Groton, Connecticut and Charleston, South Carolina. Pacific Fleet crews were based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 2 Polaris missile depots were established in the United States, Polaris Missile Facility Atlantic at Charleston, South Carolina in 1960 and later Strategic Weapons Facility Pacific at Bangor, Washington. To transport missiles and other supplies from the missile depots to the forward deployment bases, Several cargo ships were converted to carry missiles and were designated as TAKs, operated by the military Sea Life Command with a mostly civilian crew. The advent of the Trident I missile, refitted to 12 Atlantic Fleet SSBNs starting in 1979 and with a much greater range than Polaris or Poseidon, meant that SSBNs could be based in the United States. The 18 Ohio-class submarines, slated to replace the 41 older SSBNs, also started commissioning in 1981, initially carrying 24 Trident I missiles but later refitted with a much larger and more capable Trident II missile. In the late 1970s it was decided that Pacific Fleet Ohio-class SSBNs would be based at Bangor, Washington, collocated with SWFPAC, and that the refitted Trident I SSBNs and additional Ohio-class SSBNs would be based at a new facility in Kings Bay, Georgia. Also, a new missile depot, Strategic Weapons Facility Atlantic, was constructed at Kings Bay to replace Portland. The SSBN facility at Rota was closed in 1979 as Kings Bay began refitting submarines. As USS Ohio commenced sea trials in 1980, the 10 remaining Polaris submarines in the Pacific Fleet were disarmed and reclassified as SSNs to avoid exceeding SALT II treaty limits. The SSBN base at Guam was closed at this time. By 1992, the Soviet Union had collapsed, 12 Ohio-class SSBNs had been commissioned, and the START I Treaty had gone into effect, so Holy Lock was closed and the remaining 31 original SSBNs disarmed. Most of these were decommissioned and later scrapped in the ship submarine recycling program, but a few were converted to other roles. 2 remain in service but decommissioned as nuclear power training vessels attached to Naval Nuclear Power School at Charleston, South Carolina, USS Daniel Webster and USS Sam Rayburn. The later versions were larger, weighed more, and had longer ranges than the A1. The range increase was most important. The A2 range was 1,500 nautical miles, the A3 2,500 nautical miles, and the B3 2,000 nautical miles. The A3 featured multiple re-entry vehicles which spread the warheads about a common target, and the B3 was to have penetration aids to counter Soviet anti-ballistic missile defenses. The B3 missile evolved into the C3 Poseidon missile, which abandoned the decoy concept in favor of using the C3's greater throw weight for larger numbers of new hard and high re-entry speed re-entry vehicles that could overwhelm Soviet defenses by sheer weight of numbers, and its high speed after re-entry. The abandoned decoy system for the B3 was known to the UK where it was adopted and evolved into Super Antelope, KH-793 and later relabeled Chevelin. British Polaris. From the early days of the Polaris program, American senators and naval officers suggested that the United Kingdom might use Polaris. In 1957 Chief of Naval Operations R. Burke and First Sea Lord Louis Mountbatten began corresponding on the project. After the cancellations of the Blue Streak and Skibbold missiles in the 1960s, under the 1962 Nassau Agreement that emerged from meetings between Harold Macmillan and John F. Kennedy, the United States would supply Britain with Polaris missiles, launch tubes, RBS, and the fire control systems. Britain would make its own warheads and initially proposed to build 5 ballistic missile submarines, later reduced to 4 by the incoming Labour government of Harold Wilson, with 16 missiles to be carried on each boat. The Polaris sales agreement was signed on April 6, 1963. In return, the British agreed to assign control over their Polaris missile targeting to the SACEUR, with the provision that in a national emergency when unsupported by the NATO allies, the targeting, permission to fire, and firing of those Polaris missiles would reside with the British national authorities. Nevertheless, the consent of the British Prime Minister is and has been always required for the use of British nuclear weapons, including the Polaris and Trident missiles. The operational control of the Polaris submarines was assigned to another NATO Supreme Commander, the SACLANT, who is based near Norfolk, Virginia, although the SACLANT routinely delegated control of the missiles to his deputy commander in the Eastern Atlantic area, Commandant, who was always a British admiral. Polaris was the largest project in the Royal Navy's peacetime history. Although in 1964 the new Labour government considered cancelling Polaris and turning the submarines into conventionally armed hunter-killers, it continued the programme as Polaris gave Britain a global nuclear capacity perhaps east of Suez at a cost £150 million less than that of the V-bomber force. By adopting many American methodologies and components, Polaris was finished on time and within budget. On February 15, 1968, HMS Resolution, the lead ship of her class, became the first British vessel to fire a Polaris. All Royal Navy SSBNs have been based at Foslin, only a few miles from Holy Loch. Although one submarine of the four was always in a shipyard undergoing a refit, recent declassifications of archived files disclosed that the Royal Navy deployed 4 boatloads of re-entry vehicles and warheads, plus spare warheads for the Polaris A3T, retaining a limited ability to rearm and put to sea the submarine that was in refit. When replaced by the Chevelin warhead, the sum total of deployed RVs and warheads was reduced to 3 boatloads. Chevelin. The original U.S. Navy Polaris had not been designed to penetrate anti-ballistic missile defenses, but the Royal Navy had to ensure that its small Polaris force operating alone, and often with only one submarine on deterrent patrol, could penetrate the ABM screen around Moscow. The result was a program called Chevelin that added multiple decoys, chaff, and other defensive countermeasures. Its existence was only revealed in 1980, partly because of the cost overruns of the project, which had almost quadrupled the original estimate given when the project was finally approved in January 1975. The system became operational in mid-1982 on HMS Renown, and the last British SSBN submarine was equipped with it in mid-1987. Withdrawn from service in 1996. Replacement. The British did not ask to extend the Polaris sales agreement to cover the Polaris successor Poseidon due to its cost. The Ministry of Defence upgraded its nuclear missiles to the longer-range Trident after much political wrangling within the Callaghan Labour Party government over its cost and whether it was necessary. The outgoing Prime Minister James Callaghan made his government's papers on Trident available to Margaret Thatcher's new incoming Conservative Party government, which took the decision to acquire the Trident C4 missile. A subsequent decision to upgrade the missile purchase to the even larger, longer-range Trident D5 missile was possibly taken to ensure that there was missile commonality between the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy, which was considerably important when the Royal Navy Trident submarines were also to use the naval submarine base Kings Bay. Even though the U.S. Navy initially deployed the Trident C4 missile in the original set of its Ohio-class submarines, it was always planned to upgrade all of these submarines to the larger and longer-range Trident D5 missile, and that eventually, all of the C4 missiles would be eliminated from the U.S. Navy. This changeover has been completely carried out, and no Trident C4 missiles remain in service. The Polaris missile remained in Royal Navy service long after it had been completely retired and scrapped by the U.S. Navy in 1980-81. Consequently, many spare parts and repair facilities for the Polaris that were located in the U.S. ceased to be available. Italy, during its reconstruction program in 1957 to 1961, the Italian cruiser Giuseppe Garibaldi was fitted with 4 Polaris missile launchers located in the aft part of the ship. Successful tests held in 1961 to 1962 induced the United States to study a NATO multilateral nuclear force, consisting of 25 international surface vessels from the US, United Kingdom, France, Italy, and West Germany, equipped with 200 Polaris nuclear missiles, enabling European allies to participate in the management of the NATO nuclear deterrent. The MLF plan, as well as the Italian Polaris program, were abandoned, both for political reasons and the initial operational availability of the first SSBN George Washington, which was capable of launching SLBMs while submerged, a solution preferable to surface-launched missiles. Italy developed a new domestic version of the missile, the SLBM designated Alpha. The program was cancelled in 1975 after Italy ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, with the final launch of the third prototype in 1976. 2 Italian Navy Andrea Doria-class cruisers, commissioned in 1963 to 1964, were fitted for but not with 2 Polaris missile launchers per ship. All 4 launchers were built but not installed, and were stored at the La Spezia Naval Facility. The Italian Navy cruiser Vittorio Veneto, launched in 1969, was also fitted for but not with 4 Polaris missile launchers. During refit periods in 1980 to 1983, these facilities were removed and used for other weapons and systems. Operators. Current operators United Kingdom, Royal Navy, United States Navy, Italy, Marina Militare. See also, List of missiles, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. References, Notes. Bibliography, Polaris, a further report on the Fleet Ballistic Missile System. Flight International, 751 Euro 757. November 7, 1963. Further reading, Parr, Helen. The British Decision to Upgrade Polaris, 1970 Euro 4, Contemporary European History 22 No. 2 pages 253 Euro 274. Moore, R. A Glossary of British Nuclear Weapons Prospero Journal of BROHP. 2004. Dr. F. Panton. The Unveiling of Shivalin. Prospero Journal of BROHP. 2004. Dr. F. Panton. Polaris Improvements and the Shivalin System. Prospero Journal of BROHP. 2004. Dr. Peter Jones Director, OR. Shivalin Technical Program. Prospero. 2005. Various authors The History of the UK Strategic Deterrent, the Shivalin Programme, Proceedings of a Guided Flight Group Conference that took place on October 28, 2004, Royal Aeronautical Society. ISBN 1-85768-109-6. The National Archives, London. Various declassified public domain documents. Hansen, Chuck. Swords of Armageddon, U.S. Nuclear Weapons Development since 1945. Sunnyvale, California, Schukelia Publications. ISBN 978-0-9791915-0-3. 2,600 pages. External links, Lockheed Martin Polaris website, Federation of American Scientists History of A1 Polaris. See also a 2HTM, a 3HTM, and B3HTM, http, www.Massey's Sotomac Glossary PDF University of Southampton, 2005.